I'm Shanie Reichman. I'm the Deputy Director of IPF Atid, which is the Young Professionals Program of Israel Policy Forum. Most of you I see are pretty familiar with us, but for those who aren't, Israel Policy Forum is an organization that was established under the leadership of then Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin back in the 90s to advance support for the Oslo peace process in both the American Jewish community and among policymakers in Washington. And of course, our work has been shaped by our environment over the past few decades, but now we still continue to advance Rabin's vision for peace and the two-state solution amidst the many different threats. Right now, the primary threat is unilateral West Bank annexation, which most of our work, and you will get a lot of emails hopefully about it, is directed at that, but we still make space for some of these other important conversations to happen amidst that. And you will hear at the end about different ways to get involved with IPF Atid and Israel Policy Forum, but we're incredibly active, especially now because we are uniquely positioned to transition to digital opportunities, luckily. And this program in particular is part of our Women, Peace and Security channel, which was created, actually launched back in LA, but is now a national program back in the fall. And it's intended to advance women's involvement, expertise, and leadership for more effective American diplomacy in the Middle East and a future two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This was born out of the idea that we know what a positive impact it makes on a peace process to have women involved in it. And given that that's sort of the narrow focus of Israel Policy Forum, it made sense to dive into this space a little bit as well. I'm actually really excited to see the people in attendance on this call because so many of you actually work in this space in the Israeli-Palestinian policy and civil society space, and really across women, peace and security fields. And I actually want to reference a few of your organizations because a lot of you are partners from us from Israel and the region: Informed Dvorah, Women Wage Peace, Kids for Peace, Pathways Institute for Negotiation, Education, and We Power. And in DC, New Story Leadership, Center for New American Security, and the Washington Institute, as well as people from governments, consulates, and a lot of academic scholars on this topic. So I'm really appreciative that you took the time to spend with us here for the next hour. And I'm really looking forward at the end during the Q&A to hear your thoughts and hopefully any feedback that you have for us in addition to questions for our speakers. So the goal of today's call is sort of to dive into how both the very bizarre political instability in Israel, in addition to COVID-19, has impacted women in particular in Israel and across the region, and also to speak about the WPS agenda more broadly, which many of you are quite familiar with. We are going to have about 25 minutes with our speakers, with Adam Moscow, who's going to be moderating. And then after that, we're going to transition into a Q&A, which you will all be able to ask questions either in the chat, which I think you should all see at the bottom of your screen. I'm sure many of you are familiar with how the Zoom calls work by now, or you should have a Q&A button. Yeah, I see that you do. And then I'll allow you to actually speak. So I'm now going to introduce Adam Moscow, who is a member of the Young Leaders Circle of the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs in Canada. He has previously served as policy advisor to Canada's Minister of Environment and Climate Change and at Canada's mission to the UN in Geneva. He is active as a global shaper of the World Economic Forum and a member of the Schusterman ROI community. And in his IPF capacity, he is a 2018 IPF Atid Charles Bronfman convener. So I will hand it over to you now, Adam.
Thank you, Shanie, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And I know that we're going to have a very interesting discussion with speakers from the U.S. as well as Israel and the Palestinian territories, joining us to talk about women, peace, and security, which is something that I got to know a couple of years ago working in the Canadian government. When Canada hosted the G7, I was working on policy related to gender equality. And I had the opportunity to work on something called the ELSI initiative, which is all about getting women involved meaningfully in United Nations peacekeeping. And that's where, for the first time, I got to meet leaders in this field called women, peace, and security, and military leaders, police officials, all women who are incredibly dedicated to advancing the agenda and committed to enduring peace processes. So we have some incredible speakers who I think that you have read about, and I won't read their bios because we really want to get right into the discussion, but a range of perspectives and really robust academic and practical expertise. And we're going to start with Dr. Shira Efron, who is a policy advisor here at Israel Policy Forum, based in Israel. And Shira also maintains roles with INSS and the RAND Corporation. In the past, she's also worked with the Center for American Progress and the Institute for Inclusive Security based in the US, which is a real leader in women, peace, and security. So we're going to start with Shira, and we're going to ask her to please give us an update on what's happening in Israel, in particular in the Knesset, and how we got to where we are in terms of women's representation.
Oh my goodness. So hi, everyone, and shalom. And I want to be brief because I think this discussion would be really interesting if we focus on, the woman's angle and not so much on how we got here. But I just want to add that you probably not read the Bible and you said too much, but one thing that you didn't say that I think is important is I'm on the board of directors of Forum Dvorah, which seeks to advance the participation and role of women in decision-making and decision-making positions and processes that pertain to issues of national security. And, peace is one of them. And actually the Institute for Inclusive Security, where I worked, was the precursor to Forum Dvorah in Israel. So where did we start? Well, for those of you who have been following, and I'm sure everyone on the call has been following, Israel has gone through 3 rounds of election in the last year. And finally, although it brings, it's a relief that tomorrow, it's been a hectic day here, but tomorrow Israel's going to swear its new government, and it's sort of a unity government. It's called a unity government, which, when it was created or agreed upon, neither side, which is the sort of like the bloc headed by Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, and the other side headed by Benny Gantz, neither side were able to form a coalition. And in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis, which, speaking from Israel, it seems like a distant past. No one is it's sort of in the mindset we're beyond that. The purpose of this unity government was really to get Israel past the present coronavirus crisis. We could go talk about it, but there were lots of concessions made, primarily on the part of Blue-White, that basically has been shattered into pieces. They've received important roles in the government, with Benjamin Gantz being the defense minister and Gabi Ashkenazi being foreign minister, and some other portfolios. But when you read the coalition agreement, it seems that the focus of this unity government was less on emerging from the coronavirus crisis, and more to ensure that Netanyahu stays in office as he goes through his legal troubles in the first 18 months, and then that he continues to benefit from the services of a prime minister and his family in the subsequent 18 months. Also, and it's not my quote, I think Ehud Barak said it, when you look at this government where Israel is maybe emerging from the medical part of the crisis, but certainly not the economic part of the crisis, it's going to have 36 ministers, which is twice as much as the usual. The probably deputy ministers is going to be double that number. Until today, it wasn't even clear who's going to be the health minister and why if this is such an important role, why this was not the priority. And in the midst of all that, and I'm probably going to get to it, it's something that's been high on IDF's agenda for quite a few years now, and really the front run, thinking about these issues, is of course the annexation that of parts of the West Bank that is looming July 1st. In terms of women representation, I mean, it's been deteriorating instead of improving. You saw the positions of women in the list of the main parties were not high. And then when it comes to, so this affects obviously the number of Knesset members who are women. At Forum Dvorah, our aspiration is to get to parity, but we would be happy with a quarter, with a third. If you look, we need to look at the final numbers. You're going to have a few women ministers, but in what roles? What would be their portfolios? How many general directors of government offices are we going to have? very interestingly, the Attorney General found the time today to send a message to all government offices saying that by law, they have to ensure there's diversity, and called on them to have more women in senior roles in government offices. So maybe we will see some improvement in the next, as the government forms. But it has not been the best time for women in Israel. And I think my fellow panelists are going to speak more about how COVID-19 is hurting women more than men. So the representation of half of the population is even more needed than usual at this time of crisis.
Well, thank you, Dr. Shira Efron. That is a sobering way to begin, but certainly a realistic take on Israel today. Indeed, it's my pleasure.
I have some optimistic things to say,
I'm
but we
sure.
can.
We'll get there. Dr. Liat Biron, I'm excited to meet you. I've heard a lot about you and read many of your pieces before. She is the CEO of the Forum for Regional Thinking based in Israel, and previously worked in South Sudan and in refugee and IDP contexts with a number of international organizations, including Oxfam and Danish Refugee Council. And she has an extensive academic journey that she's gone through in women, peace, and security and in political science, culminating in a PhD in political science from Ben-Gurion University. So Liat, given your background in women, peace, and security, and having spent years on the ground combating gender-based violence and empowering women, can you tell us how you're thinking about progress on women, peace, and security, especially at this time when the UN Resolution 1325 establishing women, peace, and security is reaching its 20-year anniversary? And then we can talk maybe about the Israeli-Palestinian context specifically, how far we've come and what room there is for improvement.
Thank you very much, Adam. I'm very excited to speak with you today. Just a small correction. I'm not a doctor yet. I'm currently doing my PhD in Ben-Gurion. I do have 2 masters, one of them in women, peace, and security. And I'm also a member of Forum Dvora, just like Shira. And I was also lucky, Shira, by the way, to meet Swani Hunt last year, which is the founder of Inclusive Security. I wanted to follow up first on what Shira mentioned, that besides the lack of women representation, and also, by the way, in Knesset committees and in other kind of any representation and decision-making, feminist scholars who analyzed the coalition agreement didn't find any mention of gender and of women. So just an interesting point to make about how much this new government is planning to take on gender or planning to take on women issues or women concerned at this point. But I will talk more about that. So generally, I can say that while WPS, Women, Peace, and Security, is making progress in the world, I feel like the way we see it in Israel, it's pretty much stuck. So we have a very active feminist civil society that wrote together a national action plan, but it hasn't been adopted yet by the government. And the National Action Plan is quite thorough. It includes issues such as women in decision-making, gender mainstreaming, protecting women, stopping violence against women, but the government in Israel has yet to adopt it. I just want to say that in many other countries, about 83 countries to date, already have a national action plan for women, peace, and security, and are already in their second or third version and time frame of implementation. So it makes it even more peculiar that Israel still doesn't have a national action plan. And right now we don't have a government, so it's pretty much stuck on that aspect. Our Palestinian neighbors are ahead of us on women, peace, and security. They have a national action plan, which women organizations in Palestine are utilizing, and they're pushing for women representation. There is a lot of mention of the Israeli occupation in their national action plan, as well as other issues that women are concerned about, including violence against women. While the Israeli National Action Plan really seldomly touches on the issue of the occupation, although it does talk about conflict prevention. So like I said, there isn't a government for more than a year, so no one to advocate. And now with the coronavirus, I mean, who knows what will happen with the new government, as governments in Israel for years now haven't prioritized women's security issues, including funding for violence against women, for fighting violence against women that was promised after the mass protests that took place in 2018 in Israel by women's organization. And so they promised there will be budget, but that was promised and we haven't seen anything from that yet. About the influence of the pandemic. So pandemic, like any emergency, first of all, exacerbates inequalities, but also produces opportunities for change. I did a small kind of analysis of the coronavirus crisis in Israel based on the three main pillars of the women peace and security agenda. So the main three pillars are protection, prevention, and participation, also known as the 3 Ps. So looking at protection. So more women in Israel have been murdered since the beginning of the lockdown, which exacerbated violence against women. And women organizations have been organizing protests, but not much has progressed. In that aspect, I think the government is failing to protect women. Also, the majority of health staff are women, and there was severe lack of protective gear. So that's another point of protection that I've identified. In terms of prevention, failing to address, of course, violence against women, but also ongoing operations in the West Bank, and of course the annexation that is approaching. So in aspect of violence prevention, I don't see how that's going to improve the situation between the Israelis and the Palestinians or promote peace. Participation, like Shira mentioned, women are excluded from decision making, but also the exit strategy team, for example, in the National Security Council, hasn't included women, only 2 research assistants, and then women organizations protested and lobbied, and they added several women. Still not satisfying in my opinion, but it was an improvement. Women are pushed aside right now in the management of the crisis, which is very militarized, masculinized kind of authority and expertise. I mean, as you are aware, most of Israel's budget goes to the defense ministry, and so the Ministry of Health has been, has seen some austerity like measures in the last year, and I think this was evident in the pandemic outbreak. So there is a need to redefine security and to think about these issues to include more of a gendered aspect of security, and women academics and feminists in Israel are trying to do this as we speak, but facing still a lot of challenge. So that's more or less the update from my side about women, peace and security in Israel and the corona.
Wow, well, thank you, Liat. That was fascinating stuff. So we're still trying to get our third panelist on. I'm sure that many of you have noticed in the chat, and we are very hopeful that she will be able to join us. Wafa, she is. We'll bring a whole different perspective. But perhaps we can discuss a bit more about Forum Devora, Dr. Shira Efron, if you don't mind, just telling us a bit more about what the forum has been active in, and also what the plans might be as Israel finally does have a government, what that will mean for your work to empower women in the national security establishment.
So the forum has been primarily gathering and bringing together a network of experts. And, you'd be surprised. This is always the funny thing, right? They said, oh, we couldn't find women experts to be in this committee or another. But there are actually plenty of women experts on every issue pertaining to the most hardcore security topics. So Forum Torah brings this network of experts together. And we have a few lines of efforts. First of all, now we are joining other feminist organizations, but with our unique focus on the peace and security angle, and the security, because peace is not something that you speak about in Israel so much these days, unfortunately. So this is our focus. And we're pushing for the inclusion of women in decision-making. For instance, now backing the Attorney General call and making sure that at least, maybe we cannot control the political coalition negotiations, but when it comes to professional appointments of senior government officials within ministries themselves, this is where we're hoping to make a dent and have an influence. In addition, we're working with the media extensively, ensuring that women are featured in discussions, because it's not just in the decision making, right? It's in discussions and bringing their perspectives to either, we're talking about the traditional media, television, and press, and we're encouraging our network members to contribute, to write, to be interviewed. We've created a database of women experts that we share with all television networks and newspaper editors. So now it's actually, we don't have to, of course the effort continues, but they come to us when they need, when they're looking to avoid, how we say today, a mantle, which has been a good development. Another initiative which we're really proud of is what we call Forum Dvorah 2.0, which is for more junior and mid-career level professionals in the security field that are looking for the mentorship that is so needed. And I'm on the board. I'm really proud that I'm working with such distinguished women that have made careers in the IDF and the Mossad and the Shin Bet when there were no women around, and there were no women to mentor them. And we are trying to, at least for the next generation, provide that mentorship, which is important both for men and for women, but we are focusing on that part. So this is what we are working on now.
Thanks so much. That's a great update. Now I want to encourage everyone to start submitting questions. We have a couple that have come in, and we'll give you some time to formulate some ideas and questions. In the meantime, I wanted to ask a question for Liat, and actually for both of you, really, what are some concrete steps that Israeli and also Palestinian actors can take right now, given the current circumstances that you've outlined so well? Concrete steps, maybe even some quick wins that would allow both actors in the region to demonstrate a real commitment to the women, peace, and security agenda as being so fundamental to the future. And also, what are some barriers to taking those steps, and how could those be potentially mitigated? Of course, adopting the action plan would be a big first step.
I think that women organizations and feminist activists and scholars are doing more than we can, I mean, there's been endless roundtables. It's been a few years of roundtables actually to work together. And I saw there's a question in the Q&A about how do you bring such diverse sectors together when you have secular Jews and Haredi and Arab Israelis and Palestinians and Ethiopian, and really Israel is such a diverse country. And I think one of the most important thing in the Israeli National Action Plan, as it was developed by civil society in Israel, it really tried, I can say they were not 100% successful, because the Palestinian Israelis felt a bit excluded in the process at some point. So I will not say it was a perfect process, but there was a genuine attempt to kind of try to bring a diversity. And it is very, very challenging, and especially in the political context in Israel. I mean, Israel has gone really right-wing, and it's quite difficult, to push, even if you're a radical feminist activist, when you're dealing with a political reality that doesn't, like Shira said, use the word peace, or, it doesn't kind of, on when we're talking these days on annexation, it shows that things are pretty bad, and you have to kind of try to work it out in this kind of political atmosphere. Now, I still believe in saying things straightforwardly and I mean, trying to kind of also be as inclusive as possible. And the One Peace and Security, after all, is about conflict. And WPS in Israel has been utilized for other purposes that are not necessarily related to the conflict, but more for gender equality or representation, kind of more softer kind of, but very important aspects of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Because I mean, it's quite a vague and general agenda that I think one of its, some say it's a weakness, but it's also a strength. It can accommodate so many different ways of utilizing it on the ground that every local context can develop its own national action plan. But like I said before, the fact that the government is not taking ownership, is not collaborating, they're still not doing serious attempts to adopt the national action plan, although they have reported in one incident that they have, but they haven't. So, you know, this all really poses big challenges, because the first step in taking the WPS, although it's possible without adopting a national action plan, it does make it formal. And once it's formal, then you can really hold the state also accountable, and you can follow up and monitor on the implementation of the national action plan. So I hope with the new government, I know that we will keep taking it forward, and we will, I mean, feminist activists and scholars in Israel will keep pushing for the adaptation of the national action plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Liat. Well, let's go to questions, because we have some coming in and the time is going by quickly, and I want to make sure that we get some more questions. So first of all, from Jonah, just, you know, while we have you, Liat, just to clarify a bit, for those that haven't followed the research that shows that peace agreements last longer when women are at the table, if you could shed a bit of light on that, and then we'll head into some more Israel-specific questions. That's for you, Liat.
Sorry, can you kindly repeat the question?
We have some people asking about the research that has shown that peace agreements are more durable when women are included in negotiating them. And so is that message being heard in Israel?
Yes, I mean, I don't know if it's being heard, but this research has been used, I mean, by advocates of women, peace and security. Personally, as a feminist women, peace and security scholar, I mean, it is a very important point, but this is kind of a way to try to justify women's inclusion as being, you know, as being something that is valuable and kind of something that can be used. And I prefer the notion that women have the right to be included. I mean, but it is true that when women are included in peace processes, I mean, it's a more sustainable peace. But then comes the issue of, is it just about representation? Is it just about the quantity? About add women and steer, which means you're just adding women to the table, sometimes even just several women, and basically it's not really doing a lot of change. It's not really affecting, you know, gender relations. It's not bringing progress to gender equality. It's not challenging the real structural factors that are pushing women out in the first place. So I think there is a need to look at that aspect as well. I want to say that about the Palestinian activists, there is an article by Vanessa Farr that it talks a lot about Palestinian activism by women's organization, and it's fabulous. So I will send a link to this article later if people are interested.
Thanks so much. So just a reminder before I continue that you can actually ask your question live. We can simply, if you write in the chat, I have a question, then Shanie can enable you to talk, and then we can hear your voice. Let's start with Alexander, who is asking, to what extent is the WPS agenda in Israel complicated because of differences between sectors, communities, secular Jewish, Arab Israelis, Haredim, national religious, Russian Jews, Ethiopian Jews, etc.? And how do we overcome such differences in a national strategy on women, peace, and security? So who would like to take that?
You know, I can start, but I think Liat is really the expert on the topic. But I think from where I sit, I think, yeah, the diversity issues, the complex, it is complex, but I think, this Israeli mentality of, I'm translating from Hebrew, it's like a friend brings a friend over, right? It's in those circles of decision makings, there's dominate the scene, and they bring the people that they served with them in the IDF or in other security services. They're buddies. And I think the committee that Liat mentioned is illustrative. So the Israeli National Security Council found itself, like the rest of the world, right, facing this plague, this global pandemic. And a team of really well-intentioned people, experts, some of them started the Weizmann Institute, said, we will help you. You need help with processing data, analyzing data. But that's the reason why they didn't have the woman. They said, we just invited our friends. So they invited another friend, and another friend, and another friend. It blew up to be a 31-member team with 2 women that, as Liat said, were research assistants, and only because it was leaked, they kept it secret, right? Only because the composition of this committee was leaked, people started asking questions, and then they woke up. It was not even in the back of their mind that something looks bad in this committee. Now, it's true that in response to public pressure, they've added a few, women experts, which is great. Very few, by the way, a handful. Of course, they haven't added an Ethiopian, someone's from the Haredi community, of course, no Arabs. So I think the question of diversity is just not ingrained here as it is in other places in Canada and in the United States, where I've worked most of my professional lives. And when we speak about how to change that, I think there needs to be an understanding in Israel that it's in its strategic interest to ensure that women are represented in all decision-making processes, especially the ones that pertain to peace and security we're talking about now. And we can't bring peace, but at least make sure there are women around the table. I'll let Liat continue, but I think there's an example of something much more controversial that the Israeli government, Benjamin Netanyahu, in 2015, the late of 2015, adopted a government resolution. It was 922, famously known, and it called on minimizing the gaps between Israel's Arab and Jewish populations, and it spoke about injecting enormous capital into the Arab sector to narrow the gap. And mind you, this was the most hawkish right-wing government Israel's ever had, because they realized that that's in Israel's strategic interest to ensure that not every 5th citizen is marginalized and not integrated into society and economy. So I think this is where Israel should start with, having this strategic shift in its mindset. And from then, it's going to be much easier to adopt these national plans that we're talking about.
So let's continue because we have lots of questions, but thank you very much, Shira. Let's hear a bit from Vivian Silver, who has her hand up. We're going to unmute you.
Hi.
Take it away, Vivian.
Among other organizations, I am a member of Women Wage Peace in Israel, and we have 50,000 members. So we are the largest grassroots women's peace movement in the country. I know, Adam, you're familiar with the movement. I wanted to ask you, Liat, you mentioned, is the issue women's representation, or is the issue the feminist lens of women that can influence the peace process in a certain way? Because the number of women, not the number of women, but the kind of women who have been ministers in this past government have not really been inducive to the process of peace. And so that's an issue that we've been dealing with in Women Wage Peace. I'd like to hear from you about that.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I was starting to address this issue before, and I think it's an ongoing discussion among WPS scholars also that say that it's not just enough to add women and steer, but you have to make sure that women's perspectives are also included. But like you said, there has been some right-wing ministers, and by the way, some of them I might not agree with them on all of their opinions, but they have progressed women's issues in some ways. And because I've interned like many years ago in the government, and there's always been on women's issue kind of work brought together by members of the Knesset from the left and from the right. Shuli Mu'alem with Zava Galon, and kind of working together on women's issues. So, but on that aspect, but it's less relevant to peace. It's more about, like gender equality or violence against women issues at times. When it comes to peace, I feel we're not in a good time right now. I mean, I see what's going on even in the left parties, and, there's been kind of not much discussion about these issues, as you've seen with the Avoda, with others that have joined the Gantz coalition. I'm sure they're very critical, but some of them, but they're not voicing it at the moment because this topic is just not on the table. If women should bring a different perspective, I mean, there's been many researches and opinions about, are women inherently peaceful? Because women can be many things, right? Women as actors can be peacemakers. They can be also, wagers of war, and they can be, just 2 days ago, I was in a panel that talked about women in the military. And there is also these voices that say we should include more women in the military. And that is the real gender equality, because that is the way to be included. And you see, I mean, that's a more, I call it liberal feminist kind of point of view. And then there is the more kind of, peace, feminist peace activist point of view. So there is a diversity. I think that Israel has gone a bit, and I'm looking at the main organization, like Shdulat Anashim, and they've gone a bit to the liberal feminist direction. If you compare it to real radical feminist activism in Israel, like Women in Black, right? Women in Black were an amazing organization. After there was Women in Black in Israel, there was also in Serbia, and there are other places. It really influenced. I mean, it had a huge impact, although in Israel, and then there was the four mothers that got Israel out of Lebanon. So, and there's Women Wage Peace right now, which I really appreciate, and I'm really happy about the work that you're doing, and I hope that we'll see, more progress on that aspect, and that it will also come into the government. But the fact is that we don't have a left-wing government at the minute, and right now, there's been a lot of compromises. I think Shira can talk more about that, but the issue of the annexation is a result of a compromise between Gantz party and Netanyahu, which eventually came together against all expectations. And then you have the opposition, and what can we do now? I mean, what can the opposition do now to stop the annexation? I don't know. I think the US will have to play a big part in that, and I hope that Biden will. So, but let's see.
Thank you, Liat, and thanks for mentioning the annexation question. We actually had a question from Hamutal Guri, who is a feminist peace activist in Israel, wondering just about this annexation situation, analyzing it from the WPS perspective and the critical gender perspective as well. What can be done, and how does this current status quo reflect perhaps a lack of gender considerations? And perhaps, Shira, would you like to start on that one?
Sure. I'll start with the general ramifications of annexation. And I think that connects to a lot of what we've been discussing, that there's so many issues, right? So the gender issue always is being pushed aside. So when we talk about the annexation, there are so many more immediate implications that I think of, more than how they affect women specifically. And this is the priority. And unfortunately today, because of a variety of circumstances and processes, we don't have this cross-border collaboration between women's issues, and if they exist, they're very minimal and they're not public because of the anti-normalization movement on the Palestinian side, and also on the Israeli side has been fatigue. So you don't see this sort of cross-border meaningful push, and definitely not in Israel. I think on the annexation, and for some of the people that are listening, really IPF has been talking about the risks of annexation long before it became an item on the coalition agreement, anticipating this was coming. As most of you know, in the coalition agreement that was signed as part of a compromise, as Liat said, Benny Gantz, who is not known as a pro-annexation person, and definitely not Gabi Ashkenazi, had to compromise and agree to a formulation that says that they will bring the annexation to a vote, which would of course be approved in the Knesset in its current composition, subject to approval by the US, and some weird wording. Now, you know, we could talk about the views of annexations, whether they annex territory, it's still an open question. It depends on not just Biden, I think it also depends on the White House. We are hearing pushback from Arab countries that are approaching the president's son-in-law, Kushner, and saying, well, you think we're not going to care and we're not going to do something, we're actually going to do something in retaliation. So I think, and we're hearing the Europeans, and I think we do need to remember that even though this is part of the coalition agreement, Benjamin Netanyahu has been pretty status quo leader on the Palestinian question for a long, long time. So it's a question if there is annexation and how much this administration is going to be okay. They green-lighted it, and it's a priority of some members of the administration. But if this administration really pushes for it until November, and then who knows what happens in the U.S. if in the elections, if there is election, right? We were hoping that the election would take place, but so the question, if there is annexation and how extensive it is. And my assessment is that if there is an annexation, the Israeli government would try to keep it to a minimal one that would both satisfy the base, not satisfy, but at least they'll say, oh, look, we are extending Israeli law, that's the euphemism that they use, on land in Judea and Samaria, you know, it's not West Bank here, but also doesn't rock the boat too much and doesn't undermine ties with Europe, with Jordan, which is a key priority, and also doesn't risk more damage to the Palestinian Authority. My fear, and there are a few fears, but one fear is not so much from the U.S. response against Israel. I think that if Israel does it this way, the response might not be that harsh. But if you read the World Bank report from 2 weeks ago, I think it came out, they had a statement there that they're anticipating that donations to the Palestinian Authority are going to be at the lowest point in a decade or two this year. And what you hear from professionals in Europe, that they're saying, okay, listen, we've been bankrolling this thing, anticipating a two-state solution. We've been building the PA. The whole idea was that we would help support the Palestinian Authority, strengthen it and build it because it's supposed to be an independent state. But we have other priorities. There's Syria and the refugees from Africa that are coming here, and we are in the middle of an economic crisis. And if Israel wants the land so much, it can also pay for it. And this is something that I don't think Israel understands the implications. There are other issues that, of course, are detrimental to me. I'm a supporter of peace between the people, and I think it makes peace even less possible. And of course, it would undermine the Jewish and democratic character of the state of Israel. You could argue it would make it more Jewish, but definitely not more democratic. I let Liat maybe respond on the women angle.
Well, one thing that I wanted to do, but I didn't have the time, so if anyone wants to take this as a project, is to do kind of a gender analysis of the Trump plan. I'm pretty sure there's not going to be a very strong gender component, if at all. And that just brings kind of the fact that they're not really thinking about impacts on women or impacts on men or any kind of, they're not really thinking about this from a gendered perspective, because it's not really, part of their system, or so it seemed at this point. I think it's going to cause greater insecurity for Palestinian women. Obviously, annexation, and only yesterday, an 18-year-old, maybe not 21-year-old boy was killed by a stone in the West Bank, which is really sad. And I think the annexation, which will mean formally apartheid, and it will mean more forces eventually coming in to the West Bank. So more soldiers is not just more risks for Israeli soldiers, but it's also more suffering for Palestinians, including for Palestinian women, which already suffer a double oppression, by the fact that the occupation is oppressing them, and then there's the Palestinian men who are suffering, and also they're suffering from violence and gender equality issues. So and there's a whole issue of insecurities from house demolitions and education and food insecurity. So the annexation will definitely mean bad news for Palestinian women and further insecurities. And I wish we had the Palestinian representative in the panel, because I'm sure she would say more, but that's the way I at least see it from my perspective at this point.
Thanks so much, Liat. That's very helpful. And thank you, Shira, as well. So a reminder that we still have a few minutes for a question. So if anybody wants to add anything, that would be lovely. You can tell us in the chat that you want to ask a question, or put the question in the Q&A function. Meanwhile, I wonder if I can just ask a question about diaspora Jewish communities. Many of us on the call come from that here in Canada, in the US, etc., and what we can do to support organizations at the forefront of women waging peace in Israel and the Palestinian territories, given this challenging context politically, socially. How can diaspora communities play a role, and perhaps also including the major established diaspora organizations? Are they doing enough to push the women, peace and security agenda, for example, AIPAC and others? Who wants to start?
Yeah, go ahead.
How can IPF engage? I think there's a lot of feminist organizations that really need support at the moment, both funding-wise, because there's a big competition on funding, and also just being heard and getting their voices heard. And really, we have an amazing field of feminist activism in Israel, which is not, unfortunately, reaching the decision makers as much as I would hope they would. Basically, I think as much as it's possible to make the connections, to make sure that these voices reach the government, if it's possible to push for the adoption of the National Action Plan as soon as there's a new government. I mean, we'll see. There'll be a new government, and we'll need help in policy making, and in raising, lobbying, creating as much awareness to these issues with the new members of Knesset. I mean, you have to remember that a new Knesset is also an opportunity. So, in that aspect, if there's an opportunity also to reach members of Knesset and to try to do what we can, I mean, at this point in time.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Liat 100%. Unfortunately, this discussion, and it's not a discussion that I encourage at Forum Dvorah. We are actually mostly funded by domestic support, Israeli support. It's Israeli donors, ourselves included, but the members of the forum that are working to make sure the forum is sustainable. But continued support, both financially and in facilitating cooperation with other organizations, featuring experts. in panels, not just panels on an issue that is clearly discussing the issue of women, but just highlighting other voices in panels and organizations. The problem is that I think the Jewish community and the Jewish philanthropic community that really cares about Israel normally was hit also by this COVID-19 crisis. I just heard that Jewish summer camps in the United States, because they cannot convene this summer, are going to face a budget deficit of $150 million. So when you think of those numbers, and of course, you know, the priority is saving your own home first and then turning to Israel. So how in this climate that is so challenging for really well-intentioned people, and even, you know, civil society activists and philanthropists, to remember that it's not always an issue of life and death, although sometimes it is. The gender issue is an issue of life and death, but it's still a priority issue, and highlighting it and bringing the attention of the Jewish community to this issue, I think it's also important. There was a question in the chat, I think, about the database of Forum Dvorah experts. So it is available on our website, and I can share it. And there are other databases of women experts by field, which make it really easy to find experts in virtually any field that is needed, and I think they should be highlighted.
Thank you very much, Shira. We have a hand raised from Will Vanderbroek. We want to bring him on.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for being here. I wasn't sure if I should ask this question, but since the topic of diaspora Jewry was brought up, I think the relationship between diaspora Jews and Israel and Israelis is a complicated one, and it's one that's experienced differently by Israelis versus diaspora Jews. And I think sometimes there's, from my experience from talking to Israelis and from being in Israel, sometimes I think Israelis don't realize how much Israel means to diaspora Jews and also how much it impacts us. And one thing that's really frightening in this hawkish government that you guys have mentioned is the willingness of this government to align itself with, at times overt, but more often covert anti-Semites in the diaspora. Trump has repeatedly used anti-Semitic language in his campaigning. He has refused to denounce anti-Semitic groups. Netanyahu is playing buddy-buddy with Orban. Bolsonaro just used language from Auschwitz. And then you have Yair Netanyahu making tweets to praise these governments or to praise a Christian Europe. And that's really scary, because one of the things Israel is supposed to bring us is a level of protection for us Jews, even if we're not in Israel. And I'm just wondering if that ever gets mentioned among Israeli opposition camps and those who are opposing the government. Thank you.
We'll have to tackle that first.
Shira, you want to go? I feel like I've spoken so much, so.
So did I. You know, I think the issue of how the Israeli government, and you talk about this hawkish government, the one that's forming could have been more hawkish even if it wasn't for the coalition agreement, so it could be worse. But clearly aligning itself with one party, this bipartisan support that you have for Israel, and Israel just like being a consensus, a bipartisan consensus is eroding, and this is an issue. And what you're describing is sort of another level on that. I don't think it's comforting, but you mentioned Yair Netanyahu. I mean, I think it's not just with the Trump administration. It's with other administrations in Europe that are anti-Semitic. And there is discussion about it in Israel about the need to maintain close ties with the Democratic Party. And I think that, amongst the readers of Haaretz who read certain columns, there is mention about this important issue that you raised, but I don't feel like it's a pressing item on the agenda, unfortunately. And I don't know, Liat, you can correct me if I'm wrong. But this is where the conversation, the discourse between Israelis and diaspora Jews is so limited, especially on the side of, I don't know what to call it today, I'd say progressive, on the progressive side. I think there's a very active conversation on the other side of the political map between the very, sort of like right-wing conservatives on both sides in the United States and Israel. I don't think there's a parallel discourse that explains to Israelis, not just AJC, but just in a way that speaks like what you just said, as a young Jewish person in America that cares deeply about Israel, explains your concerns to Israelis. I think that's very much lacking.
Yes, and I think that women networks, Israeli, American, I think they're very important. I mean, we're both in very critical political times, now, and you're facing elections. Who knows what will happen here with the political situation? I mean, basically, I think progressive forces unite. I mean, basically, we want to see changes in Israel, in the US, and it's very important that American Jews will be involved in what's going on here. And will be more aware of the feminist activism in Israel and all the things that are going on, and if able to support from the US side, because we all know that the US is very, 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 very important for Israel. Right now, the EU, France is talking about doing something against the annexation, but to be honest, the EU, that's fine, but the real power pressure, the real force that is important for Israel, that's the US. It's inevitable that eventually that's where the real chance of making a difference or putting pressure on Israel, that's the one place that Israel government cares about.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. My name is Rachel Wallace, and I'm chairing IPF Atid's Women, Peace and Security, or WPS channel, and I also sit on IPF Atid's steering committee in Los Angeles. Thank you, William, for that question. I think that's such a perfect note to conclude on, actually, because with Israel Policy Forum, that's actually a key issue that we engage in through various channels and perspectives, is how to strengthen that relationship and discuss that relationship between the Jewish diaspora and Israel. So with that being said, I'd really like to thank our panelists today, Dr. Liat Biron, Dr. Shira Efron out of Moscow, for such brilliant and beautiful insights. And I'm sorry that we had a technical Zoom glitch with our last panelist, Wafa Ibn Berry, but this is a really good excuse and cliffhanger for you all to tune in to future webinars and sessions like this, where we will continue to feature many more voices and women, because that's a key goal of this channel. I can say personally that I learned so much and am taking away so much today, but I'd love to hear from the audience. I know some of you are already typing into the chat. How many of you have gained an understanding of the importance of women in Israeli-Palestinian affairs? Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of very positive feedback in the chat. So I hope today's webinar really challenged all of you to think about the importance of women, both Israeli Jewish, Israeli Arab, diversity of women at a grassroots level, as well as government and diplomatic levels. As many know, at Israel Policy Forum, we work to promote a two-state solution with Israel's security, democracy, and Jewishness at the forefront. We recognize that research suggests that negotiations are more successful with women at the table, so we see promoting women in Israeli-Palestinian affairs and peace building as one important way to achieve a two-state solution. We also believe, as mentioned, in promoting more women in Jewish nonprofits and in Jewish life who can be advocates for women in the peace process as well. That's why we're weaving WPS into our various short-term and long-term projects, such as Israel Policy Forum's Annexation Watch project, which you heard a bit about today. Annexation Watch monitors efforts to promote West Bank annexation and expose its consequences for Israel's future as a Jewish, democratic, and secure state. On the Israel Policy Forum website, you can view analysis about the annexation, including economic and security ramifications of it. And just like all of Israel Policy Forum's positions and projects and stances, everything is incredibly well-researched and pragmatic and very thorough. And positions are developed in conjunction with partners in Israel and researchers in Israel, including Dr. Shira Efron, who's with Israel Policy Forum in Israel now. To learn more about our work and Israel Policy Forum, if you are not sick of us yet, you can tune in today, 5 p.m. Eastern Time. JCPA is actually hosting a webinar featuring our very own policy director, Dr. Michael Kaplow, on the political situation in Israel, which I'm sure you will all enjoy. And for those who enjoyed today's panel and who want to work with us to promote women's voices in the peace process and in Jewish communal leadership, you're welcome to reach out to me. You're welcome to reach out to our incredible IPF staff who were on the call today, including Shanie and earlier Adam. And if you're interested in getting involved, we actually have a working group that we invite you to join that brainstorms ideas for programs like this one and other webinars and other sorts of events. Programs like these are made possible with volunteer leaders across North America, so we invite you to stay involved. And most importantly, we'd like to thank you for being here with us. Your contributions and questions to this discussion are truly valued, and anyone who has further questions or further thoughts or who wants to continue the conversation for a little bit longer, Shanie and I will stay online for a little bit longer for anyone who has more questions or who wants to contribute. So thank you again very much, and we hope everyone is staying safe and well.